On the last morning of the Reich, when the guns had finally gone quiet around his headquarters, and the white sheets were already tied to the trees, General Karl Vogler still believed it. He believed it as he burned documents in a steel barrel behind the villa. He believed it as he watched his staff officers line up, one by one, to surrender their pistols to the advancing Americans. He even believed it as he raised his hands in front of a young sergeant with a Thompson submachine gun who could not have been older than his own son. America was soft, decadent, careless. That was what he had been told since the first day he wore a uniform. Democracies argued. Democracies hesitated. Democracies did not have the stomach for a real war. Karl Vogler had built his life on that assumption. He was 52 years old, tall, thin, with the straight spine of an officer who had spent 30 years being saluted. He came from a Prussian family that measured itself in generations of service. His grandfather had worn the Pickelhaube under Kaiser Wilhelm. His father had died in the mud of the Somme. He himself had risen carefully, methodically, through the ruins of the old army into the new one that replaced it. He was not a fanatic, at least not in his own mind. He was a professional. He believed in order, in discipline, and in the idea that Germany was surrounded and misunderstood and must defend itself with steel. In the winter of 1945, his command had dissolved around him. Divisions that existed on paper consisted of a few hundred teenagers with rifles. Fuel was a rumor. Ammunition was counted in handfuls. Orders from Berlin came on crackling radio waves. Hold, counterattack, never retreat. Reality said otherwise. Reality arrived in the shape of American armor, grinding down the roads that had once carried his own columns. When the American advance finally reached his sector, resistance lasted less than an afternoon. A few shells, some smoke, a scattering of terrified Volkssturm. Then the motorized columns rolled in, men in uniforms, the dull color of dust, chewing gum and calling out to each other, as if they were on maneuvers, not occupying enemy ground. Vogler had expected chaos, looting, drunken shouting. His staff had whispered about Negro troops and Jewish revenge, about the horrors that would follow if they fell into enemy hands. The propaganda ministry had made sure every German officer carried those images in his head. What he saw instead was procedure. The American sergeant who disarmed him did not gloat. He took the general's pistol with a sort of weary politeness, checked the chamber, and slipped it into a canvas bag already heavy with other captured weapons. An officer behind him, no more than 30, inspected Vogler's papers, glanced at the field gray uniform with its scarred medals, and said in clipped accented German, "You are General Karl Vogler?" "Yes," Vogler answered, eyes level. "Commander of the 49th Corps." The American nodded once, made a note on his clipboard, and gestured toward the road. "You and your staff will be transported to a collection point," he said. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. If any of your men have wounded, tell my medics now." The words hit Vogler harder than the shelling had. The Geneva Convention. He knew the rules. He knew how many times his own country had ignored them when it was convenient. He thought of Soviet prisoners starving in open fields. He thought of orders sealed with eagles and wax that had never mentioned mercy. "Why?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Why would you do that for us?" The young American officer did not smile. "Because that is the law," he said simply, "and because one day we may also be prisoners." The answer stayed with Vogler as they marched. It stayed with him while they were loaded, under guard, into the back of trucks and driven away from the shattered town that had been his headquarters. It stayed with him overnight, in a makeshift cage of barbed wire where hundreds of German officers sat on their packs and stared at each other in the dark, listening to the rumble of artillery moving east, away from them. They did not know where they were going. Rumors flickered like fireflies over the wire. Some said they would be shot at dawn. Others claimed they would be exchanged for American prisoners. A colonel swore he had heard that high-ranking officers would be sent to England to answer for everything that had been done in the East. No one, not one of them, believed the truth when it first circulated. "They are going to take us to America," whispered Major Hesse, a staff officer who had a talent for acquiring forbidden information. "Across the ocean, to camps." "Impossible," someone scoffed. "We are too many." "They have ships," Hesse said. "More than we can imagine. They have space, food. They will intern us there until they decide what to do." "America will not waste that much effort on us," another officer objected. "They will want us out of the way, not fed and guarded for years." Vogler listened in silence. His mind rearranged maps automatically. To move thousands of prisoners across an ocean at war required escorts, fuel, coordination. It required resources that Germany could not have spared even in its strongest year. Maybe that was precisely the point. Days later, when they were herded toward the rail yard, he began to suspect that Hesse was right. The freight cars waiting for them were not cattle wagons, but repurposed passenger coaches, stripped and crude, but still infinitely better than the boxcars he had seen used in the East. There were Red Cross markings on some. American guards checked names against lists. Water and rations were issued before they boarded. The train journey blurred into a gray band of days and nights. But there was one moment Karl Vogler would remember for the rest of his life. It happened when the train finally stopped moving. He had expected, without admitting it to himself, to see more ruins when the doors slid open. Bombed rail yards, collapsed bridges, smoldering towns. That was what Europe looked like in 1945. That was what war did to countries, even victorious ones. Instead, the first thing he saw was color, not on the film. In his memory, everything from that day was still black and white. Steel, wood, faded uniforms. But compared to the ash palette of Germany, the American coast seemed almost saturated. The sky was a clear, hard blue. The ships in the harbor were painted neat gray and black. The cranes were orange and green. There were no bomb craters, no burned-out wagons, no carcasses of locomotives left to rust where they had died. They had arrived in New York. Vogler stepped down from the rail car onto solid, undamaged concrete. Ahead of him, beyond the line of guards and fences, rose a forest of masts and derricks. Freighters, troopships, tankers, all moored side by side. Farther still, in the haze, he caught a glimpse of something he recognized even from a distance. A tall woman, of copper and stone, raising a torch over the bay. The Statue of Liberty. He had seen drawings of it, of course. He had read reports that called it hypocritical American propaganda, a monument to lies about freedom. Now, seeing it in person, he felt something twist in his chest that he refused to name. Next to him, Major Hesse let out a low whistle. "They did not bomb this place," Hesse murmured. "Not once." "Out of range," Vogler said automatically. "Out of reach," Hesse corrected. not just of planes, of everything. The harbor was not quiet. Engines roared, winches squealed, men shouted to each other in English, in accents Vogler could only half distinguish. But there was no panic in the noise. It was the chaos of work, not of fear. American military police formed a tight corridor from the train to the dock. They were armed, serious, efficient. They did not yell. They used hand signals more than boots. German officers were counted, checked off against lists, assigned to groups. A medic walked down the line, pausing when he saw a bandage or a limp. "Wounded to this side," he called to his assistants. "They go aboard first." A wounded colonel in front of Vogler gritted his teeth. "I can walk," he said in German. "Save your pity." The medic, a freckled man who looked like he should be fixing cars back home, frowned. "Pity is not the point," he replied, his German accented, but understandable. "You get on board now because infection does not care about rank. If you fall on the stairs, you hold up everyone." He signaled to two orderlies, who moved the colonel gently but firmly toward a separate gangway. Vogler watched, thinking of the way German doctors had spoken to Russian prisoners, or even to their own conscripted kids in the last months of the war. There had been shouting, slapping, threats. Here a man in uniform argued back to a general, and nobody shot him. On the deck of the troopship, the air smelled of oil and salt. The prisoners were herded into a compartment below, but it was not the airless hole Vogler had expected. There were rows of iron bunks. There were barrels of fresh water. The latrines were crude, but they existed. No one was forced to relieve himself in a corner. An American officer addressed them through an interpreter. "You are being transported to prisoner of war camps in the United States," he said. "You will be required to work according to the rules for officers. You will receive medical care and food. You are expected to follow camp regulations. Any attempt to escape will be punished. Any abuse of guards or other prisoners will be punished." He paused, let the translator finish, then added a final sentence. "Nobody here is going to beat you for losing a war." A few Germans laughed bitterly. Others stared at the floor. Vogler kept his eyes on the officer's face. It was not a friendly face, but it was not the face of a man delighted by an enemy's humiliation. It was a man doing a job. The voyage across the Atlantic mirrored the one he had taken in the other direction 4 years earlier, when he had traveled to Africa with Rommel's Corps. But everything about this ship felt larger, newer, cleaner. It was not a rusted hulk pressed on to a desperate task. It was a piece of a machine that still hummed at full power. On the third day, allowed brief time on deck in controlled groups, Vogler leaned on the rail and stared at the gray water. Next to him, Hesse spoke quietly. "They could have sunk us in the harbor," Hesse said. "Spend the ammunition, call it an accident, and no one in Germany would ever know. Instead, they feed us and take us across an ocean already full of their own transports." Vogler made a non-committal sound. "Propaganda," he said. "They want us to go home someday and talk about their soft hearts." Hesse shook his head. "They do not know your name or mine," he said. "We are numbers on a list. This is not theater for us. This is procedure for them." Vogler did not answer. But that night, lying on his bunk in the dim light, he thought about the word procedure. He thought about the millions of pages of orders he had signed in his life. Some had sent men to the front. Some had consigned them to punishment battalions. Some had crossed desks where nobody asked if this was right, only if it was possible. What he saw around him now was a country that had made decency itself into a procedure. Not perfect, not soft, just built into the machinery. After 2 weeks, land appeared again. This time, instead of the jagged European coast, it was a wide, flat shore lined with docks, warehouses, and more cranes than Vogler had ever seen in one place: Norfolk, Virginia. The heat hit them first when they disembarked. It was a heavy southern warmth, thick with the smell of pine and salt. The Germans blinked in the sudden sun. Convoys of trucks waited on the pier, canvas tops raised, engines idling. The Americans handed each prisoner a small parcel as he passed: a cardboard box containing soap, a towel, a toothbrush, a razor, and a bar of chocolate. Vogler picked up his parcel slowly, as if expecting it to vanish. "What is this?" he asked the interpreter. "Personal kit," the man replied. "You will need it in camp." "Chocolate?" Vogler repeated. The interpreter shrugged. "Standard issue," he said. "Welcome to America, General." It sounded like a joke. It was not. The journey inland took days. The trucks moved in long columns along highways that looked, to Vogler's European eyes, absurdly broad. They rolled past gas stations with neon signs, past neat farmhouses with cars in the driveways, past fields so large that a German estate would have fit into a corner of one of them. On one day, when the convoy halted at a siding near a small town, Vogler stood in the back of the truck and looked around. He saw boys in civilian clothes riding bicycles along the road, waving at the soldiers. He saw women carrying shopping bags out of a brick store with large glass windows. Above the store, a sign advertised refrigerators, radios, washing machines. Washing machines. He knew that in Berlin, women were queuing for hours to wash clothes in cold water from broken pipes. Here, in a town nobody had heard of, machines did the work. "How long have they been at war?" Hesse asked, half to himself. "Almost as long as we have," Vogler answered. "And they can still buy washing machines in villages," Hesse said. "We cannot even buy bread in cities." Later, standing in line for food at a railway rest stop run by the American Army, Vogler watched a cook heaping spoonfuls of mashed potatoes and green beans onto metal trays. The portions were not enormous, but there were vegetables. There was meat. There was coffee that tasted like coffee. "This is for us?" Vogler asked the guard. "Same as the enlisted men," the guard answered. "Officers too good for beans and mash?" Vogler swallowed his reply. He thought of the watery soup in German field kitchens. He thought of the lice-infested bread given to Soviet prisoners. He took the tray. That night, in the corner of the barracks, where the officers had been quartered for the stopover, one of the younger generals exploded. "This is all a trick," General Kruger declared, pacing. "They are trying to buy our loyalty. They want us to collaborate. Remember that. Do not be fooled by soap and chocolate." "No one here is collaborating," someone said tiredly. "We have nothing left to give." "They want to show us America is strong," Kruger insisted. "They want us to think resistance is pointless." Vogler looked up from his bunk. "Is it not?" he asked. "Pointless?" Kruger glared at him. "You speak like a defeated man," he snapped. "I am a defeated man," Vogler replied. "So are you. The difference is that I can see it." For a moment, the barracks fell silent. Then another officer, older than both of them, chuckled without humor. "You two can fight about pride," he said. "I am going to enjoy the first full stomach I have had in a year." The trucks rolled on the next day, deeper into the continent. The forests changed, the accents of the guards changed. But one thing did not change. There were no ruins. Vogler had ridden through half of Europe in 2 wars. He had seen shattered cathedrals, cratered fields, skeletons of factories. Now, mile after mile, he saw bridges intact, factories with all their windows, train yards full of rolling stock that had never known the shock of blast. Once, as they passed an enormous complex of buildings with high silos and conveyor belts, an American engineer riding in the truck pointed and shouted something over the engine noise. "That is just one plant," the interpreter translated. "They make tractors there, and parts for other factories." "How many such plants?" Vogler asked. The American shrugged. "Hundreds," he said. "Maybe thousands." Vogler did not answer, but in his mind something heavy shifted. He had come to this land expecting to measure its weapons. What he saw instead, from the back of a prisoner truck, was something far more dangerous than guns. He saw a country that had waged a global war for years and still had the energy to build tractors, washing machines, and chocolate for its prisoners. When the convoy finally turned off the main road toward a set of low hills topped with barbed wire and guard towers, he had already realized one brutal fact. Germany had never really understood what it was fighting. The gate of the prisoner camp swung open. A sign over it read, in English letters he could now slowly parse, "Camp Helena, Prisoner of War, Enclosure Number 4. Vogler stepped down from the truck, parcel under his arm, and looked around. The barracks were wooden and plain, but newly built. The fences were high, the towers manned. An American officer approached with a clipboard, flanked by guards. "Welcome to your new home, gentlemen," the officer said, through an interpreter. "You will find it less unpleasant if you follow the rules." Vogler believed him. The first surprise inside Camp Helena was the library. Karl Vogler discovered it on the second week while being marched with a group of officers to the shower block. The camp itself was exactly what a prisoner of war camp should look like. Long wooden barracks, barbed wire in double rows, watchtowers at the corners with machine guns and board guards. Inside the wire, everything was measured, scheduled, and fenced again. Germans here, Italians there, work details organized like military units. But between the barracks and the kitchen stood a low building with large windows and a sign in English and German. Recreation Hall, Library. Vogler slowed automatically. Books were a weakness he had never fully confessed to. He had smuggled volumes into trenches in the First World War. He had hidden philosophy and banned novels behind official reports in the Second. Now, in this strange quiet between losing a war and whatever came next, the idea that there might be something to read other than regulations and Bible pages tugged at him like a child at a sleeve. The American guard noticed him looking. "You can use it in the afternoon," the guard said in clumsy German. 2 hours. "General, yes? You get same rules as everyone." That afternoon, Vogler went. Inside, the recreation hall smelled of dust and ink instead of sweat and damp wool. Wooden tables stood in rows. A ping-pong table had been pushed against one wall. And along the far side, in neat shelves, stood books. Real books. Hundreds of them. Most were in English, but there was a section in German, and even a few in French and Italian. A German lieutenant, who had once been a school teacher, was acting as librarian under American supervision. He looked up from his ledger and stiffened when he saw Vogler. "Herr General," he said, I did not expect this." Vogler interrupted, scanning the spines. "Who provided these?" "The Americans," the lieutenant said. "Some for us, some for them. They say keeping prisoners busy prevents trouble." The explanation was practical, almost cynical, but the effect was undeniable. Around the room, officers who had once commanded regiments sat hunched over chessboards, newspapers, and novels. A few Americans, off-duty, played cards at a corner table. No one shouted. No one snapped orders. The only raised voice came from a record player in the corner, where a scratchy big band tune played so softly it was more suggestion than sound. Vogler picked a book at random, a German translation of Mark Twain. He had heard of the author, never read him. He sat at a table, opened the book, and found himself, for the first time in months, transported somewhere other than a staff map or a ruined town. Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn were not propaganda. They were not lectures about capitalism or speeches about freedom. They were children playing tricks, running away, worrying about their souls in a church that did not look like any Vogler had known. Yet between the lines he could feel a world very different from his own. Adults in authority were mocked, rules were bent, a slave helped a boy, and nobody in the story called it a crime. When he closed the book, the camp looked a fraction smaller. Over the next weeks, Camp Helena revealed itself, bit by bit. The food remained consistent: beans, bread, meat once or twice a week, vegetables that actually had color. There was work, but not the kind designed to break men. Officers were assigned to administrative tasks, to teaching classes, to supervising games. Enlisted men went out under guard to surrounding farms and factories. One morning, Vogler watched through the fence as a group of German prisoners marched off under American escort toward a nearby field. When they returned in the evening, faces flushed, they were carrying sacks of corn and trays of fresh eggs. "They pay us," one of the enlisted men told him, still surprised. "Not much, but enough to buy cigarettes, chocolate, even small things from the camp shop." "Pay you to work?" Vogler repeated. "While you are prisoners?" The man nodded. "They say if we work, it helps their farms," he explained. "And they say the convention allows it. They show us the exact article." That afternoon, in the library, Vogler found a copy of the Geneva Convention in German and read the relevant section. The Americans were doing exactly what was written, no more, no less. That was another shock. The rules were not a suggestion here or a tool to use when convenient. They were a framework inside which even victories had to fit. Not all Germans reacted the same way. General Kruger, the same man who had shouted about tricks on the train, spent his days pacing the barracks, muttering about humiliation. He refused to drink the camp coffee because it tasted like surrender. He wrote long letters in a tight, angry hand, denouncing American hypocrisy and promising that a true Germany would rise again. Others went the opposite route. Colonel Lammers, a staff officer with neat handwriting and no visible ideology, threw himself into the classes organized by the camp's cultural committee. He learned English, chess openings, and American baseball rules with equal enthusiasm. "They let us study their history," Lammers told Vogler one evening, waving a thin pamphlet. "Look at this. They argue about their own president in public. Newspapers print jokes about him, and nobody is shot. Imagine writing a joke about our leader last year. It would not have been printed," Vogler said dryly. Exactly, Lammers replied. Here, criticism is not betrayal. That is dangerous, Karl, for them and for us. What do you mean? Vogler asked. For them, because too much criticism can weaken a country, Lammers said. For us, because we were told a system like this could not fight. And yet here we are. The letter sat in his hands for a long time before he unfolded it. It was 1953, 8 years after the barbed wire of Camp Helena had disappeared behind the horizon, and General Karl Vogler was now simply Herr Vogler, a man in a plain suit, working in a modest office in a rebuilding West German city. The windows of his apartment looked out on new concrete instead of ruins. There were cars in the streets again. Children laughed in the courtyards instead of hiding in cellars. He had managed, so far, to live 2 lives at once. In one, he was the retired officer whose war had ended in honorable captivity, a man whose experience was useful when politicians needed to understand the old Wehrmacht. In the other, inside his own head, he was still the prisoner, watching the corn elevators rise into the American sky, still hearing the factory whistles that signaled beginnings instead of air raids. Now the government was asking him to choose which of those men he wanted to be. The letter was from the new Defense Ministry. It was polite, careful, full of phrases like historical responsibility and necessity in the current geopolitical situation. Between the lines, the message was simple. The Federal Republic needed an army. The old enemy in the East had become the new threat. The Americans, the British, and the French all agreed that West Germany had to contribute to its own defense. They were looking for officers with experience, men who knew command, logistics, the reality of war. Men like him. They wanted him back. For a long time, he read the letter over and over. Then he put it down and walked to the window. Outside, a group of boys were kicking a ball against a wall. Their shouts floated up in a mixture of accents. Some of them wore shoes that had clearly been donated by foreign charities. One had on a baseball cap with an American team's insignia, a souvenir from the occupation forces that had never quite left. On his bookshelf, between volumes of Clausewitz and a battered copy of Mark Twain, stood a thin notebook. It looked ordinary. Inside were pages from his time in captivity, notes, names, impressions he had written down at night in Camp Helena, so that he would not forget. He opened the notebook now and leafed through. Here was the entry about the library. Here, the first time he had seen American magazines openly criticizing their own government. Here, the day one of the guards had argued with his sergeant and not been punished for it, because the sergeant had been wrong. And here, on a page dated June 1945, were 8 words he had written in a cramped, shaken hand. Power that restrains itself is the rarest kind. He closed the notebook again. In Camp Helena, he and the other generals had sat around tin mugs of coffee and argued about what they had seen. Kruger had died in captivity, still hissing about betrayal. Lammers had openly converted to democracy, throwing himself into every discussion group the Americans had offered. Most of the others had drifted somewhere in between. They admired the American capacity but insisted that a German form of democracy would have to be different, more orderly, more disciplined, less noisy. But something had stayed with all of them, even the bitter ones. It was not the chocolate, or the showers, or the library. It was not even the abundance of the farms and factories. It was the fact that their captors had chosen not to use all the power they possessed. that they had written rules for themselves and actually followed them when no one could have stopped them from doing otherwise. Now his own country was asking for power again. Tanks, planes, uniforms, rank. Vogler knew exactly how easily power slipped its leash. He spent the next days visiting old comrades. Some had already agreed to serve. They spoke in practical terms. If we do not build a new army, someone else will march across our border, General Strauss told him. Would you rather have Soviet tanks in Bonn or German soldiers under a democratic government? We can shape this force, said Colonel Lammers, who had accepted a position in the planning staff. We can insist on rules, on civilian control. We can do it differently this time. The Americans insist on it. They learned from us what happens when you do not. Others refused outright. I will not wear a uniform again, said Major Hesse. His hair was thin now, his face lined. Not for anyone. I have seen where obedience leads. It is not the same state, Vogler argued. Not the same government. Not the same flag. The cloth changed, Hesse replied. The men did not. Some of the same judges sit in their seats. Some of the same businessmen own the factories. Tell me, Karl, who will profit if we build this army, and who will pay if it goes wrong? Vogler had no answer. Back home, that night, he poured himself a glass of cheap wine and sat at his desk. The Defense Ministry letter lay next to the notebook from Camp Helena. Between them he felt as if he were back on the pier at Norfolk, looking at two different ships. On one he boarded and sailed back into the only world he had ever known. Orders, ranks, staff maps. On the other he stayed ashore and tried to live as an ordinary citizen, pretending that none of his experience mattered anymore. He thought of an interview he had read recently in a newspaper. An American journalist had tracked down one of the former German prisoners and asked what he remembered most about his years in the camps. The man had not spoken of fear or humiliation. He had spoken about a guard who, when nobody was watching, had shared his cigarettes with a prisoner and then reported himself for breaking regulations. "Why would you tell on yourself?" the German had asked. "Because the rules apply to me too," the guard had answered. "If they do not, they are not rules. They are excuses." That sentence had followed Vogler for weeks. He picked up a pen and began to write a reply to the ministry. He wrote about his age, his health, the physical impossibility of field command. Those were the easy reasons. Then, more slowly, he wrote about Camp Helena. He did not dramatize. He did not turn it into a sermon. He simply described what he had seen. A victorious power that chose to bind its own hands, that allowed criticism of itself, that fed prisoners decently not out of sentiment, but out of habit. "I cannot, in good conscience," he wrote, "help build an army unless I am convinced that it will be firmly and permanently under the authority of laws stronger than any single man. I have served under a system where uniforms and flags were used to cover crimes. I will not do so again." He ended the letter with a condition.